Hello, and thanks for joining me. Let's spend a few minutes chatting about the big ideas in the Dune series by Frank Herbert. I recently wrapped up reading all 6 of the novels in the Duneverse by Frank Herbert, and I chatted each of the individual books as I finished them, and I'll link to those chats down in the details below. But as I was reading those 6 novels, I sort of took away some big ideas that I thought wound through all of the novels. The novels are the first one is Dune, the second one is Dune Messiah, the third is Children of Dune, then God Emperor of Dune, Heretics of Dune, and finally Chapter House Dune. So let's just spend a few minutes talking about some of the big ideas that at least I took away from my reading of this series. The first one was about hydraulic. The book, it first appears in God Emperor of Dune, and it's called Hydraulic Despotism in that book. It appears then in the next book, Heretics of Dune, and at that point it's called Dependency Infrastructure. And what this concept is that a technology or some sort of resource is developed that allows humanity to rapidly expand. And a case maybe could be made in the current era of maybe fossil fuels. So the discovery and the use of fossil fuels allowed humanity to expand, both in its well-being, its population, etc. And, so another example might be electricity, something like that allowed humanity to expand into a whole new sort of niche. And so in the books, it's actually, I think, mostly represented by the spice melange. The spice is a natural resource that occurs on the planet Arrakis, and it is this spice that sort of drives the human culture of the time. And ultimately, though, here's the downside, is that, this society becomes then dependent on it. So if something were to happen to the spice, then the whole sort of civilization would be disrupted. And so you can sort of picture that, like if the fossil fuel supply for us today were interrupted, how big of a disruption in our society that would cause. It would cause political unrest. It would cause all sorts of breakdowns of systems and things like that. This is actually illustrated in the various books as the books move along through all 6 of the books. The human interaction with this resource called spice or melange. And then another kind of recurring theme, I think, throughout all the books was memory, and how what role memory plays in our lives. And in the books themselves, Humankind, now, I won't go into the details of the books because I've already chatted those, but the humanity of the time have developed as thousands of years in the future. So, and there's also been a sort of revolution called the Butlerian Jihad, which prevented thinking machines. So humanity got rid of all of sort of their computers and thinking machines in that way, but then they just really started developing themselves, their own minds. So the humans' minds and even the bodies to some degree are quite different than how we experience our day-to-day life. Some people, like the Bene Gesserit order in Sisterhood in the books, is able to actually have ancestral memories through the female line, so they can remember all their female ancestors. And then Paul Atreides, in the original book Dune, the first book, as well as the second book, Dune Messiah, also develops this skill, and he can actually access other memories as well. So then we have throughout the books, we have a couple of Golas, and a Gola is a person who's kind of like a clone from but it's from a dead body. It can be cloned into another living version of that person, and that there are certain instances where those Golas can actually, their original memories can be resurrected. And then there are also these clones, the Talaxans have these clones that also have a memory. So they're cloned. So it's not just like what we think of as a clone today. There's more sort of memories. The Bene Gesserit can also transfer their memories to another sister in their order. So there's this memory. So imagine if you have this memory, though. It is both a blessing and a curse. And the curse side of it is called abomination. This is really illustrated in Children of Dune. And to some degree also in God Emperor, but so mostly in Children of Dune, I think, mostly. But so an abomination is a person who has this sort of ancestral memories, but becomes consumed by them. So your own individuality is sort of subservient to the memory. And I thought this was really a cool analogy of how some people get trapped in the past and how that really stifles them as a person. And this is illustrated so well in the books. Memory is just a common theme throughout all the books. And then government and religion. This plays out through all of the books, the different kinds of government. So what we're dealing with at this point in the first book, and it proceeds on really throughout most of the books, is an empire. So it's a monarchy. It's a aristocracy. It's almost kind of medieval in the first few books, where there's an emperor, and then there are royal houses or noble houses like the House of Atreides, which is a house of, he's called a duke, so it's got that sort of structure as far as, power structure. And then, and as we get to like God Emperor of Dune, it's called a tyrant. The emperor at that point is Leto II is called a tyrant, because he is actually ruling the systems, where the planetary systems where humans live, in a sort of tyrannical manner. And there's not a lot of movement among the planets because of different things that have happened. So he's able to just his reign is very authoritarian. He was doing this. He had his reasons I won't go into here, but nevertheless, it was an authoritarian type of structure, government structure. The Bene Gesserits have more or less, that's a sisterhood. They're a power-broking, sort of a power. They're not a house of power, but they're an organization that wields a lot of power throughout the human planets of this human civilization, and they have a sort of democracy, but it's they have a Reverend Mother, and their allegiance is actually to the sisterhood, though, not to individuality. So, like, whereas we think of democracy as sort of in service to an individual, that is not the version of democracy that was practiced really by the Bene Gesserit sisterhood. It was a sort of democracy, but not that sort of individual individual rights democracy that we think of when we think of democracy. So a little bit different there, but there's a lot of political philosophy in all of these books, and like, what's the best way to govern people? How do people need to be governed? The books make these kind of claims that humans tend to divide off into hierarchies, and so the government really needs to reflect that in order to maintain some sort of order. And so, but there's a lot of sort of political philosophy, I think, that winds its way really through all of the books. Another sort of aspect is change, and how that governments can become brittle, because governments, like almost any other organization, resist change once they get power, And there's a saying, I mentioned it in one of the chats, where it's not so much that absolute power corrupts absolutely, like the saying goes, but actually it's that power attracts the corruptible more so than it corrupts someone. So I thought that was really interesting, and there's just a lot of interesting political sort of discussions and philosophy that weaves its way through all the books. And then, I came away from reading these sort of like an analogy of Humankind. So this is Humankind in the far-flung future. There are a few references to Earth, but really Earth exists in a memory, in the ancestral memories of some of the characters. Earth is not a place that humans still interact with or live on, at least not this group of humans. It's unclear, I think, if there are any humans at all left on Earth. But to me, this was sort of analogous analogous to when humans in early like Neolithic times, like prehistoric times, when humans, a band of humans, for example, left and went to another place, their relatives and the tribe they came from probably will never see them again. And this also happened in the book after God Emperor of Dune. There is something called the scattering, which was this because of the sort of chaotic political situation. There were many people that scattered into these unknown planets and these unknown places, and so they lost touch with the human civilization, and how that would actually change us, and how it would have been for prehistoric people to be off by themselves, completely isolated from the rest of the human population for a given period of time, and so of course would develop differently. And we see a bit of this in the 6 of these, especially in Chapter House, the last of the novels. So I thought that was a real interesting sort of thought experiment, though. Finally, I think really the main theme the biggest big idea I think that I'm taking away from the Dune series is the constancy of change, how nothing ever stays the same. And not only does it not stay the same, it's like we should not expect it to or even want it to. Because once, and this point is made over and over again, like, once you think you know something, that's when you stop growing, because you think, oh, I don't need to address that anymore because I already know that, right? So then that stops. And then that starts to stagnate. When it's no longer growing, it's stagnant. And so there's this concept it weaves its way through all the books about how necessary change is. It talks about bureaucracies in government, bureaucracies in institutions, religions, how that bureaucracies have a tendency to resist change, and then how that causes them to become brittle and stagnate over time. There's this analogy, I believe it's in Chapter House, I believe it was in book 6, where like humanity, so the Bene Gesserits exist. The Bene Gesserit sisterhood is really their goal is to guide humanity away from being children, so into a higher evolved sort of state. And it's all about balance. And so they talk about like balancing on a wave, like a surfer, right? And so the wave is constantly moving, and your job is just to stay standing up. So in the constant sort of waves of change, humankind needs to be able to remain standing, and that's not always cut and dry or easy. It could very easily be wiped out. They're sort of in a, like I mentioned, sort of analogous to maybe prehistoric humans, where some sort of disaster could actually, end humankind or end all the lives on that particular planet, or humankind in general in these far-flung planets that they live on at this point in the future. I think I will stop the chat with that. The other another thing I kind of touched on it about the genetics and the Bene Gesserit sisterhood. I think that's a fascinating sort of way to have structured these books, as far as having that sisterhood. That sisterhood exists sort of in the background, but it's constantly working what it considers to be for what it considers to be the best path for humans to take, as far as being able to stay balanced. And that is not always pretty, but politics sometimes, it isn't, because another point made is that sometimes politicians to actually create a long-term goal, and the Bene Gesserit order thinks in the really long term, to get to the long-term goal, which might be humankind's survival, there might need to be lots of suffering in the present, or a significant amount of suffering. So that sort of balance of making those types of political and social decisions, I think, is just really interesting. Okay, I think I'll stop the chat with that. I did enjoy reading all these 6. There are many more of these books set in the Duneverse by Frank Herbert's son Brian. I do not currently have plans to read those, but in the future, who knows? I might. Anyway, I'll have another book chat on something coming up soon, so stay tuned for that. Take care. Bye.